Sorry about that, everyone. I had to change how I was recording it. For some reason, it won't turn on our live stream on YouTube, so that's all right. Okay. So, like I said, we have some topics within middle childhood to wrap up, and they include cognition or thought process. We're also going to talk a little bit about IQ and intelligence during this section to kind of see what it is, and how it's defined, and if it's actually associated with anything that's important. So we'll get into that as well. But if we remember, cognition is that fancy word for thought processes, the ability to think and make decisions, to use past information to glean on what's currently being perceived or sensed from the external world. So, and just kind of going back to our basic understanding from where we were at the beginning of the semester, when we were talking about Piaget's theory, he felt that this period was what was known as a concrete operational phase. And the kind of the hallmark of this is the inability to think abstractly. Okay. And basically, what is that in its most basic terms? Well, during this phase, and the reason why it's called concrete operational is that information is set into very solid walls. Okay, so there's good guys, there's bad guys, there's cops, there's robbers, there's black, there's white. And there is no overlap between those categories. Okay, but as we know, as adults, as abstract thinkers, much of our world exists within the gray. Okay, meaning that you could have cops who do a good job, but maybe they go home and abuse their family or commit other crimes. Okay, and you could have a robber or a prison inmate who, yes, did something wrong that violated some social rule, but they also could be a good parent. They could be a successful business person. They can. So what I'm saying is that our world is much more complicated. It's much more in the gray. And that's really what we're talking about when we say thinking abstractly, is the ability to see that there isn't just good and evil, as Philip Zimbardo put it the best. The line between good and evil sits in the heart of every person, and it's us who decides on which side of that line that we stand based upon the situation we're in and the place we're in. Okay, so during this phase, and if you ever talk to kids, that there's bad, there's good, and there's angels, there's devils, and et cetera, and it's hard for young people at this age to kind of see the overlaps or the potential of overlaps between these. Okay, now with that being said, we do know that there's some variation, and that's important to keep in mind. So when we say concrete operation, we're talking about 50% or more of children, but that doesn't include 100%, because there are children who either are not at that concrete level, they're still in the previous levels, such as those individuals who exist within the Amazon area. And there's people who have had that life experience that their environment has demanded on them to think abstractly. Okay, so just remember, this is the average when we're looking at this age group. Some of the things that change during the concrete operational stage is something called reversibility. And that's the ability to reverse mental operations. And I think the best example is usually kids younger than the age of 6 or 7, if they take something apart, they have a hard time imagining how to put it back together and make it a single object again. And it's around about the age of 6 or 7 where we see this mental ability to, I just took apart my toy, but I saw it being taken apart. So in my head, I can imagine it going back together. Okay, so that's reversibility. The other thing that's a hallmark of this is classification, the ability to organize objects in hierarchical, conceptual categories. So, this is basically, if you want to think of the chart of the animal kingdom, and you have apex predators, you have apex prey, and all of these different classifications based on abilities and the need to survive. And the other thing that this period, is classification gets a little bit more complicated with seriation. So not only is the young child able to see, let's say, the difference in gender, girl, boy, they're also then able to categorize girl, boy, and then girl, short girl, tall girl, heavy set girl, skinny girl. Okay, so they're able to then seriate. What this is called seriation is a category or a classification, gets further broken down based on physical qualities that the person observes. And then, of course, this is also when children then start stereotyping based on culture and socialization of what it means to be, again, a girl who is, let's say, tall and large. And they use culture and socialization to give that individual a character that is different than girl who's short and thin, as an example. Okay. And so this is where this really starts to ramp up. This is where we really start to see children bully other children into their category. Okay. And this is kind of the negative side of this classification and seriation is we start to see, the athletic looking young boys start to bully the larger, less active boy, because they put them in two separate categories based on this height, weight, and some other qualities, and say you don't belong here in a sense. Okay, and that's just an example. And interestingly, the gender that does this the most, we often think about boy bullies and all those kinds of things, but it's actually, this is about the age group where girls start to set the standards for how boys and girls are supposed to act based on their appearance. Okay, so up until we see about 8 or 9, we see young boys who will act very affectionate with each other, almost in a feminine way. We see young boys, and what I mean, they're willing to hug, hold hands, all of those things. And what research is showing is it's not actually other boys telling them that they shouldn't do that because those are girl-like behaviors. It's actually young girls who are telling those boys that you shouldn't be hugging and kissing and not doing all of those things. Okay, now this is in middle childhood. We're going to see those roles kind of reverse when we get into adolescence, and we start getting peers telling us this is a way we should act and this is the way we should behave. But in this transition period between early childhood, middle childhood, and into adolescence, it kind of goes, everyone's the same in early childhood, except for what culture is telling us, of course, and our stereotypes we're building. But then into middle childhood, it tends to be the opposite sex who is telling each other, no, you shouldn't act this way. And young boys do it if a young girl is acting what you would consider very masculine, maybe being very competitive, and that is reversed by both boys and girls in that situation. And then again, when we get into adolescence, it's more about our peers, those people we associate with, that start to mold how we should act and how we should behave. Okay, but these are kind of the cognitive structures that support those transitions. Some other things that start to really come online during this period is the use of sustained attention, the use of memories to fill in information, and executive functions, meaning our frontal lobe of our area of our brain, where we start to be able to make more and more complex decisions. Okay, has a lot to do, again, with the environment and the amount of stimuli the child is getting and the amount of activity the child is getting. But this is also dealing with neural processes. The brain is getting ready to become completely myelinated. It's getting ready to need to make rapid decisions. It's getting ready to use past experience to make those rapid decisions. And it's also trying to use past experience to make and provide us with the ability to attend to things. So what we see during this age group is the ability to have a more sustained and purposeful attention. We see this is when children start to use their memory to inform them of how they should behave today. So this is when a child will say, well, you know, last time I stole a cookie out of the cookie jar, I got in trouble, so I probably shouldn't do it this time. Okay, that's when they're able to kind of cognitively make those associations. Okay. And I should mention, this is also, you know, this attention memory component of middle childhood is also what makes these children very susceptible to things like social influence. And if we look at, for example, even things as complex as political affiliation, okay, start to get set during this age group. So whether a child is going to grow up to be conservative or liberal or somewhere in between, those types of things, because of the attention memory thing and what they're constantly being exposed to, start to really determine kind of even things like political orientation, moral influation. We know that religiosity is really going to be, if that's part of the family and cultural system, religion is going to become solidified during this age group and become more and more important. So all of those things. When we talk about the executive function, like I said, the brain is getting ready for us to make rapid decisions as we become adults, and especially when we go through puberty. And so it's being able to take in more multiple sources of information to make those decisions. And I think that was highlighted in that previous slide when you see children are getting more and more complex with their categorization by adding values such as not only, again, male, female, but also large, small, short, tall, brown eyes, blue eyes, all of those factors. Okay. And as was mentioned, processing speed increases and neural communication becomes more efficient. But the other part of attention is what's called automaticity. And this is a process by which skills become so well practiced that you can do them without much conscious thought. So examples of this is our ability to write, our ability to ride a bike. So if we learned riding a bike during this age group, more than likely, if we never get on a bike until we're 40, we'll still be able to get on that bike and ride it. Maybe not straight, but we'll be able to ride it. And this is where behaviors become automatic in a sense. Okay, so it's when we don't have to think about how to do something or what to do. Okay. Just to kind of more emphasize, you know, our three. Well, let's see. I'm gonna skip that one. I want to kind of get to executive functioning and just kind of highlight some of the processes that go along with that, just to kind of emphasize what was just mentioned. Okay, the first thing we start to see during this age group, well, not the first, but the first on this list is cognitive flexibility. And that's the ability to switch focus as needed to complete a task. And you kind of can notice this working with a child who is 2 or 3 years old versus a child who is 7, 8 years old. So, you know, you go ask the 2, 3-year-old to start cleaning up. They're probably like, no, I'm not going to do this. But around the age of 7 to 8, even if the child is into what they're doing and you say, please start cleaning up, they can switch off what they're doing right there and go ahead and do that next task, which is cleaning up. So it's that ability that in early childhood we're not very good at, because we want to continue doing the task that we have. And we did that ability to switch is not even there a lot of times. And I know that it's very frustrating for parents. Inhibitory control, and this is the ability to stop automatic cognitive responses to do what is needed to carry out a task correctly, okay? And this comes out in what's called the Stroop test, okay? And maybe we'll do this next week. We'll do a Stroop test to see how we're doing. But basically what the Stroop test is you provide a number of words that are named colors, so blue, orange, red, okay? And at first, maybe you do it just in black lettering, but then you present the word blue, but it's written in green, okay? And what we've found is people who have really hard inhibiting control or inhibiting responses, because what we see visually first and then auditorily second, the person will look at the word blue that's in green and they'll say green. And then let's say the next word is green, but it's written in red. The instant impulse is to call it red, okay? And what we see in middle childhood up into adolescence is, while the child still is kind of trying to figure it out, am I supposed to call it green or am I supposed to call it blue? They will actually stop themselves and make a decision on what their next action should be, okay? Whereas when we get into earlier childhood, they'll go with that first impulse, which is usually the color that the word is written into, okay? This is also when children do really well with things like schedules and those kinds of things. When we look at early childhood, having a child put on a fixed schedule is very, very difficult, and it tends to be a big struggle between parents and the child. But it's when we get into middle childhood when children can actually establish a good, steady, established routine. And indeed, this is one of the tests to see if a child is cognitively behind or might have some developmental type of disability, is to see how much the child can be put on a schedule and inhibit the need to continue tasks when it's supposed to be a change in task, okay? The other thing that we see is an increased ability to use working memory, okay? Working memory, if I were to put it in the most simple terms for the sake of this class, working memory is kind of like the RAM in our computer, okay? It's the memory that is currently recording my voice, is producing these slides, is connecting to the internet, okay? It's the RAM, random access memory. Okay, and I think, most have like 8 gigabytes of RAM or something like that. But then when I turn these programs off, then they go into the hard drive, which is a long-term memory, okay? And it's just stored there. It kind of sits there until I need it again next time. And then I bring it back into working memory, okay? What we find is that our capacity in working memory really starts to take development right during this period. So I mentioned it in your computer, you might have 8 gigabytes of RAM. For human beings, it's measured a little bit different. We can hold 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information in our working memory at one time. Okay, so what does that mean? So I'll give an example. My working memory every time I tested it is about 4 chunks of information. So I'm actually a little bit below average, which I'm okay with. So what that means is if I'm given a string of numbers, okay, let's say I'm given a like they do with your phone when they're trying to give you access to something and they send you here look for these numbers and type. If the code is over 4 numbers, I have to do those first 4 numbers and then go back to my phone and look at the rest of the numbers, because I can't hold more than those 4 chunks of information. Those first 4 digits is my limitation. Okay. And what we see during middle childhood, this is where a child's working memory, this is where we're going to see if they get to that average of 7 through doing memory tasks and all those kinds of things. So this is where kind of our random access memory limitation is going to be found during this period. But this is also why children during this period can hold multiple ideas at the same time. If you think about, again, early childhood, a child could, let's say, play with a toy car. But if you ask them if they're hungry or not, they have to completely change their mindset and stop playing with the car for a minute and think about it and go, yeah, maybe. But when we get into middle childhood, this is where a child could be maybe playing with a car while listening to music, and you come in the room and say, are you hungry? And they can instantly say yes or no, because that memory system is getting larger, okay? I think we already got through this part, so I'm gonna. Okay. So what I want to do, because we already went through most of the language and whatnot, what I want to do is go through intelligence. Okay. And so one of the most common definitions of intelligence is those qualities that help us adapt successfully so that we can achieve our goals in life. Okay. And there's been some arguments about what this means. For some people, it's purely academic skills that you need to develop. So if you ever took an intelligence test when you were a child, they probably had you do something with numbers and maybe had you do some word solving problems and those types of things. But others have argued that there's other important types of intelligence, such as current movement is in the area of emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence is that ability to know how you feel in a situation, understand how someone else feels in a situation, and be able to then navigate that situation successfully. Okay. And there's been arguments about, what are the more important ones? Is there really something called emotional intelligence and academic intelligence? Are they two really separate things? And it's kind of an interesting arguments that we get into. Okay, but what we do know is that there's 2 basic types of intelligence, whether we're talking about emotional intelligence or we're talking about more of that academic problem-solving intelligence. We find that there's 2 types. One is fluid intelligence and one is crystal intelligence. But before I get into that, I want to define what is general intelligence. Okay, general intelligence is basically an equation. All right. It is your developmental age divided by your chronological age. Okay. And what's meant by that is most of these tests are a measurement of where you are in academic intelligence, in emotional intelligence. And then it's taking that score and it's dividing it by your chronological age. okay? Which if we go to this next slide, I'm going to go right here really quick, and then we'll go back, which then they multiply that by 100, okay? So this is what gives our scores for most intelligence tests. They're normed at what's called a mean of 100. That means that a person's emotional score, let's say, is 50, and their chronological age is 50. You divide 50 by 50, you get 1. You multiply it by 100, you get 100. Okay. And what we have is what's called a standard deviation of 15, which means on average, this is how a standard deviation is the average distance from the mean. Okay. So on average, IQs deviate by about 15 points. Okay. And so the majority of people, if we put this on a normal curve, 68% of individuals will score between an 85 and 115. Okay. And this is kind of how IQ scores work. Okay. But when we go back to here to these two kind of fluid versus crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence is what allows us to quickly and effectively solve novel problems which we have little training to solve. Okay, it's that ability, kind of meeting with the word fluid. It's that ability to adapt to new situations and new problems. Okay, crystallized intelligence is what we already know and can draw and solve a problem from. Okay, so this is our knowledge of the world and our experience with the world, and that experience and that knowledge is fixed, and it can be applied to any situation that comes up. Okay, so what we see though is a decrease in one as we age and an increase in the other. What we see is fluid intelligence starts high, especially in middle childhood. That's why we can expose our children to new situations and they can commonly kind of figure things out and adapt to them. And then over the lifespan, it goes down, meaning we become less and less effective with new novel situations using littler types of knowledge or little types of training. Okay. And what we see though is crystallized intelligence increases over the lifespan. Okay. So I think if we look at this from a stereotypical perspective, this is when we say an older person is set in their ways. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. Okay, this comes from this thing we know that crystallized intelligence heightens as we age, and so we use more of our fixed mindset. Okay, but these start in early childhood, and they will exchange each other starting in our 30s and 40s. I will kind of see them kind of cross each other's hairs and whatnot. Okay. Now, there is evidence to show that there are ways that you can continue having fluid intelligence, so things like being a lifelong learner, those types of things. And there's ways that you could use crystallized knowledge and intelligence to also be flexible thinkers. So I don't want everyone to think of ourselves becoming those stereotypes as we age. It's just what we see on average. Okay. Okay. So like I said, what IQ is it's your mental age, and so it's your mental age divided by your chronological age multiplied by 100. Okay. And then we see that it deviates by about 15, which gives us this curve. Okay. Now, when we get to about that second deviation, so if we write it here, so we have 85 right here, and we have 70 right here. Usually when we start getting below 85, we start getting concerned about developmental disorders, okay? More on the mild end, okay? But usually when we're below about 70, is when we're going to diagnose a child with a developmental issue. Okay. And so we get concerned at 85. We run different tests. Maybe it's has to do with other things, ADHD, trauma, something else. But usually when we get a score of around 70, that's when we're going to give a child a diagnosis of some developmental disorder. Okay. Now, on the other end of the scale, so we have our 100, 115, and then 130. Okay. When we're getting above 115, again, we're looking at them as very what you would call academically inclined. And then when we get above 130 is when we say this child is quote unquote gifted in some way at doing that intelligence test. And a lot of debate has been put behind this. It does having super intelligence above 115, 130. Is that what creates success? I got to remember his name because I can't remember it right now. It wasn't Benet. Okay, I got to get the psychologist's name. I apologize. I don't want to give you the same one. It sounds like Truman, but it's not Truman. But a psychologist was so adamant that people in the 115, 130 range have to be our world leaders. They have to be the most successful people, make the most money. They have to be the next generation of what we would consider as the leaders of the world and those types of things. And so he spent much of his life trying to prove this. So he took a cohort of kids and stuff throughout a lifespan of about 50 years. And he measured them through their lifespan and then he measured their success in life. Okay. And I think for people like me, who's somewhere in this average range, there was good news, is that most successful people don't have super intelligence. If we look at the world leaders, if we look at CEOs, if we look at people who tend to be community leaders, they usually have an IQ of between 90 to 110. Okay. This tends to be the people who ended up being most successful in life. When he went back and he looked at people who were scoring, for example, above a 130, they tended to be, they were never really successful in school. The majority of them worked what would be considered mediocre type jobs, blue collar type jobs, those types of jobs, not the world leaders that the psychologists thought they would be. Okay. And now there are some incredibly gifted people who have IQs of above 130, but it tends to be very domain specific. And meaning it's usually within, like, for example, music or mathematics, what very, very, very domain specific. Because what's thought is when you get above that 130, your mind is going all the time and you become overwhelmed. You can't handle multiple things at one time. So you tend to focus and become genius in one single area. Okay. But if we look at most successful people in the world, you have to be able to socialize. You have to be able to get to know people. You have to get to understand who they are outside of your own brain. That's what makes successful people. And those individuals tend to have an average IQ of between 90 to 110. So that's what we know about how IQ has influenced, people's outcomes thus far. But the notion, should we be trying to make our child the super genius IQ above here? Well, probably not. It's probably more important to focus on a balanced life, allowing them to understand their social world and understand things as they are. So something kind of interesting from studies on IQ. Okay. And then the question also has become, does intelligence really influence, for example, educational outcomes and wealth, things like wealth? Okay. Well, if we look at these associations, okay, intelligence, the reason this is circled is intelligence has an influence of education at 0.09, at a point, what's called a 0.09 association or predictability. And kind of let me explain this scale. These scales are set from 0 to 1, okay? At a level of 1, this is highly predictive of the next thing, meaning that this predicts it the best, okay? At a level of 0, it pretty much means that it doesn't predict it at all, okay? So what we have learned, which I think is interesting, is your intelligence actually predicts what your education qualifications at like age 33 will be at very small, very little, okay? What actually influences it more, if we look at it this way, is probably reading and somewhat a little bit more are math abilities, okay? But we also see that but educational level, and we know this, educational qualification does predict wealth. That's why you see all the promotions, go to college, those kinds of things, but not necessarily intelligence, okay? And this other line here is what seems to be most influential, is the ability to think abstractly, meaning mathematical abilities. And again, your education level seems to predict wealth the most, okay? But I'm also going to say here, there's some bigger qualifications that are predictive of wealth too, such as family income, your family social class, perceived financial, all of these, if you look at these, so here we have math and we have reading and we have educational level at 0.3, 0.27, but then previous family income 0.58, family social class 0.76. And so those tend to have much more of a influence, again, situational influence on wealth than does, you know, math and reading and educational qualifications. So some things to think about when we look at intelligence. And some other arguments about the use of pure academic intelligence is, does it predict academic achievement? Not as good. Things such as things like self-control seem to be a better indicator. Most intelligent tests are standardized. There are some what's called alternative testing methods that we find work best for certain populations. So doing that academic one with the blocks and everything seems to do very well for white middle-class children. But when we get to other children of lower economic status, for example, children who are of more of a minority role, those types of things, giving them real life problem solving instead of the abstract blocks, they tend to do better at. So those are some things to note when we're assessing intelligence, because a lot of children in low income settings get diagnosed with developmental disorders. And what could be argued is it's the test that is being used It's not actually something that we're actually accessing what their actual intelligence is, because we're probably, from what we see in most research, we're measuring it wrong. For that individual, we're probably measuring it wrong and probably should use some different other type of an assessment tool. And then, as I said, you know, so what we've really been talking about is analytical intelligence, okay? But a lot of people, I mentioned emotional intelligence that could be added to this list. There's also something that Gardner argued for, and Sternberg in his triadic theory. We also probably have a creative intelligence, which is different than analytical intelligence. It's about the ability to generate ideas to deal successfully with new situations, okay? And then there's something that Sternberg coined practical intelligence, which is to solve everyday problems by changing yourself or your behavior to fit the environmental situation. And this one probably fits very well with that term I used with emotional intelligence as well. So if we want to look at this, you know, if we were to look at this in the stereotypical cultural way, analytical intelligence is book smarts, practical intelligence is street smarts. But I would also argue creative intelligence is probably a combination of both, but more on the street smart end of the list. Okay, and I think the reason why we're seeing this movement to look at more different types of intelligence is because we know people can be very, very successful without high levels of analytical intelligence. Okay, and so I just wanted to bring that up real quick. Okay, and then Gardner went all out. He says we have existential, naturalistic, interpersonal, even body kinesthetics type of a dancer, athletes, and those kinds of things. And if we look at this list, in a way, I think we could agree with it, because I think we could put people on a public speaking level, right? There's those who are wonderful at it, and then there's us, the lower echelons of life, who struggle with it, even though we do it as prayers. Dancers and athletes, you won't, I know that's, again, I'm speaking from personal experience, not my forte, but I know there's some people who are just very naturally talented at these kinds of things, or are very effective at them. So I think there's probably some evidence, if we look at it from a what we call a qualitative experience, and look at humans as they behave, for this idea of these different types of intelligence, and some we score better at than in others. Okay, what time are we at? So I do want to hit on this just so that we can finish up with late childhood or middle childhood going into adolescence. I do want to try and finish today's lecture talking about family and the role of family as we start to transition from early childhood, middle childhood, and then into adolescence. And really what has been focused on, again, is the role of the mother and the child in late childhood. You could probably, for most of the research I've seen, you could probably replace the word mother with primary caregiver, because we have a lot more children and stuff who are, for example, being raised by grandmothers. We have single father homes where the father is acting as a primary caregiver. And so I should probably just change this term in my slide, is that just so you know, most of the literature you'll run into replaces the word mother with primary caregiver. Okay, and how does that relationship change from early childhood into adolescence? And I think that slide, where is it? I think my slides are out of, okay. And so this is where we can talk about parenting and those kinds of things. And again, I think we've already had the conversation about the different types of parenting styles. But what we find, so in early childhood, children are learning about their family culture, okay? Meaning that how their family culture is, okay? But when we start to get into middle and late adult childhood, we start to see that there's other types of family cultures, that we could have a best friend that has very different parents than my own parents, okay? And in this period where children really start to differentiate, do I have good quality parents, or do I have a preference for Billy's parents down the street because they let Billy do whatever he wants? And so this is really when we look at, if we remember, when we hit around adolescence, we stop focusing more on our family and start focusing more on who we are as an individual. So again, it comes to that simple analogy that I mentioned in the beginning of class, is if you ask a child, 5, 6, 7, 8, who are they? They're going to say, well, I'm Bill and Jan's son or daughter, okay? But then if you ask an adolescent, someone 12, 13, 14, or 15-year-old, who are you? They're more likely to say, well, I'm a soccer player, or something like that, something that identifies them as an individual more than who they're identified with, okay? And what we have found is in middle to late childhood is when we really see the child doing this comparison thing and starting to make that transition, that there's different ways of people can be. And what's important is who I am and how I respond to it, okay? And we talked about authoritative parents versus authoritarian parents. So we know that parenting reflects individualistic values, and authoritarian parent reflects values of authority, obligation to family, those types of things. We see some cultural differences, for example, frequently seen more in African-American parenting, other than some of the other cultural parenting practices here in the United States. So, and then cultural may not have a distinct parenting style. So, for example, Latino parents show a warmth and control, but low on granting autonomy. So, I think about, saying they love them, they care for them, they're their life, but then at the same time, they're very, very protective and don't let them have their own autonomy outside of the family system, okay? And so we see kind of in some cultures, there's this kind of a authoritative, but also authoritarian kind of approach. And then in some cultures, we see that it's more of one approach versus the other. And so and this is the differences that children are starting to see in middle childhood. And this is also what's creating their differentiation between, for example, cultures, ethnicity, and race. This is where they're going to say, well, Jose is Jose because he comes from a Mexican home, and this is the way he learned to do that in his Mexican home. That's kind of a stereotypical example with a very stereotypical name, but this is where children are starting to pick up those stereotypical issues, okay? Then the other thing that we start really looking at in middle childhood and in later early childhood is the difference between having only children versus having siblings. And what we have really found is having an only children versus is there any negative outcomes? And what we have found so far in the research is there's really no negative outcomes for children who are raised as only children versus children who are raised with their siblings. The thing that we have noticed is that only children are found to have a little bit more high achievement, adjustment, stronger character, and positive social relationships. Reason being is when you look at sibling households versus only childhood households, did I say that right? Households. Is that in the only childhood household, the parent has to make an effort for that child to socialize, okay? And usually the socialization that child is getting is older adults or older adolescents. And so they're learning not from their siblings who may be the same age and are developing, but they're learning how to socialize and be through usually older individuals, older relatives, those types of individuals. And so what we find is they do have a slight advantage when it comes to things like having positive social relationships, having a stronger character and those kinds of things. So, but from my perspective, I think the debate is still out on this because I think it has more to do with the family system than it has to do with whether you have an only child or a sibling. So if you have a family system that promotes high sibling interaction, but also interaction with the external world, not just the siblings, I think we would see these same types of things. And we know only children who tend to be very isolated have negative outcomes like sibling only families do. So I think the relationship is much more complex than just simply saying only children have an advantage here or siblings have an advantage here. It's a little bit more of a mixed bag. And so when we talk about siblings, we talk about things like, do they have a shared or non-shared environment? For example, we tend to find that children who, for example, have the same bedroom, the same environment, they actually have similar personalities, and they're much more similar to each other than children who are raised, for example, one's raised upstairs and one's raised downstairs. That's an example. Birth order. This has been studied for decades now. In fact, I wouldn't even say decades. It's been studied for centuries now about who's better, the firstborn, secondborn, third. We've heard I look at the jokes on Facebook all the time about being the middle child and those types of things. And what we have found is that firstborns tend to be more leaders and high achievers. But research may be confounded by what's called family size, okay? And what we really have found is that, so firstborns, dependent upon their role in the family, may become better leaders or high achievers, depending on their responsibilities to their siblings, okay? But what we really find is that birth order actually has a very small effect on actual outcomes and child success. And most of the birth order is things that we do as attributions and what we attribute to success and failure, and our own self-serving biases by saying, well, I was born the youngest, so I'm this way. So it's more of those types of things. But when we actually measure it, we really find little effect of birth order. And the relation with firstborns tends to be very much more complicated than just be a better leader or higher achiever. And then there's always the debate: do parents really treat their children the same? Usually not. To be honest, parents do either subconsciously or consciously have their favorites. But that's not uncommon for teachers and other caregivers as well. Okay. For example, studies dealing with the cute child versus I don't want to say ugly, but not so cute child. Okay. We find that the more cute your child is, the more positive attention they get, the more time attention they get, the more positive feedback they'll receive. And when they do something wrong, it's seen as less severe, so the punishment is usually less severe. When we see the attractiveness of a child go down, we see teachers and parents spend less time with them. They're more likely to give them negative attention and negative feedback other than the other children, and they tend to punish harder those children who tend to be not as attractive as one of their siblings or even a classmate in this example. So, and a lot of times these studies show that this is very much done on an unconscious level. So when we went into, for example, kindergartens and preschools, childcares, elementary schools, high schools even, and we measure them, we have the teachers take a survey of fairness. Do you treat everyone fairly? Blah, blah, blah. And they score really, really high. And they consciously state, I give all of my pupils the same amount of attention. But when we go measure it, we see these biases based upon the appearance and the look of the child. And so even on an unconscious, even though a lot of times it's unconscious, we do have these biases on the way we treat children. So, which tends to explain when we look at genetics, we usually look at what's called monozygotic twin studies. So monozygotic means that they're identical twins. Their genetic makeup is exactly the same. Okay, and one of the biggest arguments, so usually when they want to make a claim that something is genetically driven because these two identical twins were separated at birth and they were raised by two different families in two different places, but they're so similar to each other, it must be because of genetics. And that's the identical twin argument for genetic similarity. But the problem is all this research we do on just the physical looks of children and how they're treated by society the same. The truth is that the argument is, are those identical twins really being raised differently? Are they really being raised by a different kind of person that then their similarities as adults means it was genetically there? Well, what is genetically there that we know about is their looks and how society treats them based on their looks. And it probably has very little to do with their personality being genetically similar. It probably has more to do with how the world responds to children based upon their appearance. So that's the other argument on that side. So, all right. I'll finish up with single parents and the like. And again, I think this slide needs a little bit updating. It hasn't been updated since 2012, it looks like. When we talk about single parenting, there are some trends that we need to talk about. One is that parents more and more are choosing not to get married, but to have children. And in a lot of these situations, it's not necessarily that the child is just being raised by mother or father. It's usually what we're finding is that there's a lot more co-parenting going on and even more cohabitating. So what really is kind of a complication to a lot of the data that we have on single parents and those things is that the situation is a lot more complex than just saying, well, if you're unmarried, that means you're a single parent and therefore you're raising your child as a single parent. We also know that, as it says, it's a single parent can be an unmarried man or woman, a divorced or widowed man or woman. And we're seeing a lot more households with single dads in it, even though, if we look at it compared to single mom homes definitely outnumber by much more single father homes. Okay, but this 40%, I believe it's up to around 50%. I think somewhere between 40 and 50. We've seen about a 5 to 8 point increase over the last. This was 2012. We're on 2023. We've seen about a 7 to 8 point increase in the number of single family homes, because we're also now including single fathers in this realm as well. The other thing that also complicates the single parent argument is there's a lot of children who may appear to be being raised by a single mother, but a lot of times they're being raised, not a lot of times, but a good portion of the time, they could be being raised by their grandparents. And so the reason why I bring this up is that it's very complicated to say whether a child is better off to be raised with a dual parent home versus a single parent home. What seems to be more important, especially in middle childhood, is the involvement of two people who represent mother and father. And that's what our research is currently showing, that if you are, for example, a single mom, making sure both of your children have some type of male role model in their life is important. Vice versa for single dads, what we're finding is that it's much more important for that single father to seek out some type of strong female role model, again, regardless of the sex of your child, okay? And I should mention this because I know gender is getting a little bit more complex with the whole idea of non-binary versus transgender, those kinds of things. The research suggests it doesn't matter if your child is, for example, their sexual orientation is gay or straight, whether your child is transgendered, whether your child is quote unquote non-binary. We find that the healthiest setting is still having a mother and a father who represent those roles. Okay. And so those things are important to kind of keep in mind, that regardless of your child's orientation or identification, having two people involved in the child's life is important. That's what the research is suggesting right now. I think with all of the changes in relationships and stuff, and this is why I'm probably sounding a little muddy in this area, is I think we'll see a lot of changes as this trend of people not getting married continues, as we see this trend of parents having children at a later age. This trend of being a co-parent versus a single parent continues to increase. I think we'll see some changes in child outcomes, and so I think this on this topic that I think there's a wait period that we need to really determine outcomes for children. So, all right, I'm going to stop there.